Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be talking about some interesting gubernatorial elections in the Great Plains region of the country, and more specifically, why I don't think you should buy into the hype regarding these elections being competitive. This is the Wikipedia page for the 2022 Oklahoma gubernatorial election, and as you guys know, Oklahoma is a deep red state. Trump won it by over 40%. It has not really been competitive at any level in a very long time. But as you can see here on Wikipedia's graph summary, Joy Hoffmeister, the Democrat, is actually leading Kevin Stitt. So this is really interesting because Oklahoma, again, is a deep red state, and especially in a year that's supposed to be good for Republicans, you wouldn't really expect Democrats to be even leading in any polls in Oklahoma. You wouldn't expect this race to be competitive to any degree, and you wouldn't expect, for example, Real Clear Politics move this down to lean R. You wouldn't expect, these other sites to make it go from solid R to likely R. And the fact that Democrats are even the fact that we've been talking about blue Oklahoma is really weird and really interesting. And so I think it's interesting to look at, but I do want to kind of take this video to break down why you shouldn't really believe the hype and why it is just a kind of a bunch of noise that should be ignored for the most part. So yeah, let's talk about Oklahoma. So as I said, this is a super red state. Donald Trump won Oklahoma, by a lot. It was a very strong margin of victory for him, and he actually didn't lose a single county, as you can see right here. Every county was red, although some counties were close to others. As you can see, the closest county was Oklahoma County. It voted for Trump by only around 4,000 votes, so it was contested. I actually do think it will flip in 2024. But the thing is, Oklahoma County is the bluest county in the state, and it still voted for Donald Trump. Cleveland County, which is, kind of the suburbs of Oklahoma County, is also fairly competitive. Trump won it by 14, which, by the way, is still a lot, but it's a lot less than Oklahoma as a state as a whole. And then Tulsa County, which is, of course, where the city of Tulsa is. Biden did pretty well in the city of Tulsa, but in the suburbs and the surrounding areas, Trump was able to overpower him and win the county. And so, with a map like this and with margins like this, you would think that there would be no conversation of a Democrat winning Oklahoma. But what happened, or what has been happening in Oklahoma for the past decade, is that even though it's a red state at the federal level, it tends to be a lot more competitive down ballot. So let's talk about this. So if you look at the 2018 Oklahoma gubernatorial election, the Republican Kevin Stitt still won it. But if you look at the margin, it was a lot closer. Kevin Stitt only won by 12, despite the fact that Trump won by over 33%. So Kevin Stitt did 21% worse than Donald Trump. And if you take a look at the county map, Drew Edmondson, the Democrat, won Oklahoma County. He won Cleveland County. He won Muskogee and Cherokee County. He came very close in Tulsa County. So Oklahoma got a lot bluer in this gubernatorial election. Granted, it was a blue wave, and Drew Edmondson was a strong candidate. He was a statewide official prior to running for governor. But it's still worth talking about, because you don't generally see Oklahoma, a deep red state, being even within 15% the way it was in 2012. And it raises a lot of questions about Kevin Stitt and the Republican Party. So the Republican Party of Oklahoma is kind of in big trouble right now. And that's mostly because it dates back to 2010 when Mary Phelan was elected governor of the state, and she had a 7% approval rating at one point. She was unbelievably unpopular. Democrats hated her, independents hated her, even Republicans. She was a Republican. Even her own party disliked her. And so she kind of scarred the Oklahoma GOP, and she kind of gave them a bad rep in the state. And again, it didn't cost them the gubernatorial election in 2018, but it did make it a heck of a lot closer, and it resulted in a lot of Trump voters backing Drew Edmondson because they just could not vote for the Oklahoma Republican Party at the statewide level. And so that it's concerning for the GOP. It kind of created a pattern for them. And we also in 2018 saw them lose a House seat that they were considered big favorites to win, and they flipped it back in 2020. But the fact that Democrats held a House seat in Oklahoma for 2 years is still pretty bizarre to think about. But yeah, so 2018 was a pretty close election. And if you look at the 2022 Oklahoma gubernatorial election, it's pretty close in terms of the polling data. Again, right now on FiveThirtyEight, Kevin Stitt, the Republican, has his narrowest lead of all time. He's up by 5.1%. He was up by over 16 even a few months ago. And, he's only up by 5. The most recent poll from Sooner Poll actually has Hoffmeister leading Stitt. And again, Sooner Poll's not great. They're C+ rated, so they're not amazing. But, they're not, this isn't some random Democrat polling firm. This isn't a polling firm that's, trying to be biased towards Hoffmeister. This is a poll that is showing, actually fairly unbiased analysis. And you can question their methodology. You can question whether it's actually legitimate or should be considered very much, but it's still a neutral poll, and they're showing Hoffmeister ahead. And the other interesting thing here is Natalie Bruno, the Libertarian candidate in Oklahoma, did her own internal that kind of showed her polling fairly high. She was at 9% in her own internal, which is higher than she is at these other internals. So she kind of was trying to communicate that she could do well. She over here, as you can see, had Hoffmeister leaning by 1% over Stitt. And so that's interesting, too, that the Libertarian thinks Hoffmeister's ahead as well. And so, look, these other polls have shown Kevin Stitt ahead, but the fact that this is like a 5-point race in 538 is just pretty striking. And finally, I think that the final key component of this race being competitive is that Joy Hoffmeister was actually a former Republican. She's actually a statewide official. She won as the state superintendent of public instruction in 2018. As you can see, she did fairly well, only losing one county to John Cox, the Democrat, who I don't really know much about, but she ran in this race and she's a statewide official. So Oklahoma has actually voted for her by a landslide, as you can see here. She won by 25 points. And so I think she has a level of popularity that's hard for any other Democrat to get because she's known as a moderate. She was a Republican when she ran. And so that's pretty interesting to me that, she has transitioned to a Democrat to run against Kevin Stitt. And so, like, the fact that this race is even in play is concerning for the GOP. Now, that being said, it's still important to look at presidential partisanship. Like when you look at 2018, I think Drew Edmondson yes, not to take away from the fact that Joy Hoffmeister is a good candidate, but Drew Edmondson was especially good because he was actually a statewide Democrat. She ran as a statewide Republican. Consider the fact that we were coming off Mary Phelan fresh, right? Because it's been in 2018, she was still the incumbent. It's been 4 years since she left office. And yes, Kevin Stitt is not particularly popular either, but he's still not a 7% approval rating. And, the fact that 2018 was a D+9 year and 2022 is looking more like a neutral to maybe slightly Republican-leaning year, that too is to be taken into consideration. And also, finally, perhaps most importantly, polarization now is bigger than it was in 2018. And, that's not to say 2018 wasn't a polarized year, but it was a year where Democrats and Republicans did a lot better in the opposing territory than I think either party is expected to do this year, just because I think the 2020 election really did polarize us so much. So, yes, Oklahoma, this governor's race will be closer than you would have otherwise expected. That being said, and I think, the most important thing to remember here, polls tend to overestimate Democrats in red states. We've seen this before. We've seen this story before. I would not buy into the hype, and I still think Hoffmeister loses by upwards of 15%. It's still a safe Republican in my book. Now, let's talk about our next interesting Great Plains governor's race. That's Kansas. And as you can see, Kansas actually is a Democratic incumbent. So Laura Kelly, the Democrat, I think we all know a fair bit about her. She won in 2018 over Chris Kobach. Again, Kobach was a historically unpopular Republican, and similar to what happened in Oklahoma, the incumbent Republican administration under Sam Brownback was insanely unpopular, and it caused a lot of Republicans who would have, who voted for Trump in 2020 and 2016, vote for Laura Kelly. Laura Kelly was fairly popular and still is fairly popular in Kansas. She is she ran on education, and she ran on I think more localized issues, which is important. And when you're running as a Democrat in a red state or a Republican in a blue state, you have to run on localized issues. You can't nationalize the race, right? And so that is why she won in 2018. She also was bolstered by the fact that is a blue wave at her back and whatnot. But I think it is important to look at this election because it is an interesting prior. Now, obviously, in 2020, Kansas did not go blue. Kansas voted for Donald Trump by over 14%. So it was not particularly competitive in 2020, although Biden did do, he trended left. He did a lot better than Hillary Clinton. So Kansas is a left-trending state, no doubt about it. So Kelly's race is viewed as a toss-up by most people. I think she's going to lose. And I say that for one reason only. In 2018, she won by 5%. That was a D+9 year. So she ran just under 4% more Republican than the national environment, which again is a good showing for Kansas. But we're going to be probably let's say we're in a neutral year just to simplify things. That would mean she would lose by 4. And this time she's running, I'd say, much better challenger in Derek Schmidt, who's the state's attorney general. Chris Kobach was so unpopular that he was polling terribly. Derek Schmidt is, he's not an amazing candidate. He didn't really knock my socks off with his campaign, or he isn't doing that at the moment. But he's a statewide official. And he's decently well-liked in the state of Kansas. He's a non-controversial figure. And so, yes, I think there are a lot of voters in the suburbs of Kansas City and Topeka that do like Laura Kelly. And when I say voters, I mean Republicans. Like, there are a lot of Republicans in this area that like Laura Kelly. That being said, the Republicans are running also a fairly normal, fairly electable candidate, and that will be enough for them to pick off this race. I think there'll be a lot of voters who don't mind Laura Kelly who are going to be voting for Derek Schmidt just because they don't want to vote for a Democrat in a Biden midterm. And I think without the blue wave at her back, not looking too good for Laura Kelly. Now, there are a lot of people who think she's going to win, and I respect those opinions. I actually did a podcast. Go listen to it. It's on the channel on Thursday, last Thursday, where I said, Laura Kelly is probably going to lose. And, Arthur, my friend who I had on the podcast, actually disagrees with me. He thinks she's going to win. A lot of people do think Laura Kelly's going to win. This is not, this is a controversial opinion, by the way. But Oklahoma likely to go red. I think Kansas at this point is going to be close, but I do think it's going to flip to the Republicans by about 4 or 5%. So that is 2 for 2 for the GOP. Next up is Nebraska. And Nebraska in 2018, it wasn't as amazingly close as some of these other states were. It was still the reddest of these Great Plains states. But it voted for Pete Ricketts by 18%. And, now he's term limited. The Republicans are now running a local businessman, Jim Pillen. Democrats are running Carol Blood, who is a state legislator. Obviously, she's in the Nebraska State Senate. And she's actually interesting because she actually represented a district that was pretty Republican, and she is very popular in her district despite being a Democrat. Now, Nebraska's been getting really interesting for Democrats for the past couple of years because they've been a lot more competitive. So first of all, Biden was the first Democrat not named Obama in like 80 or something years to win that second district out here, won about 7%. So it was a big overperformance for him. Democrats also were not able to flip the seat at the congressional level, but they did fairly well there. Compared to past showings, I do think they're going to flip it in 2024 for what it's worth. And most importantly, back in June, a few months back, we had a special election in Nebraska's first district, which is, not the Omaha seat, but it's the seat out here that's tends to be pretty Republican leaning. It was a Trump plus 13 seat, and it only went to the Republican Mike Flood by about 7%. And yes, he didn't really run a good campaign. I think that showing isn't really representative of how Oklahoma is or how Nebraska is as a whole. But that seat, the fact that it narrowed up by 6% in a Biden midterm or in a Biden year, pretty surprising and pretty striking of how good the Nebraska Democrats have been. And by the way, the Nebraska Democrats are one of the best state parties. They don't tend to win a lot statewide, but they do very well locally. And so I think that's another important factor. So, that I think that had the preface of a maybe competitive race. But if you take a look at the polls, we have one Republican internal poll, and it showed the race within 7. Like, it was generally internal polls tend to show, try to bring confidence for their party. But this Republican poll has Jim Pillen up by only up over Carol Blood by 7%. And he's not even at 50%. He's 48%. And the fact that they're showing a tight race in Nebraska as a Republican internal is pretty surprising. And, it's just really weird because generally speaking, especially in Nebraska, which is a deep red state, like in 2020, as you can see here, it voted for Donald Trump by 19%. So it is a deep Republican state. And, for a Republican internal poll to come out and then just show a close race in Nebraska is pretty surprising. So that also surprised a lot of people. Now, that being said, again, I do not want you to buy into this poll. Yes, I do think Carol Blood's going to get 41, 42, 43% of the vote. This I believe. What I don't believe is Pillen at 48%, because here's the thing. This poll, for the most part, has a lot of Republican undecideds who maybe don't love Jim Pillen, but are going to break for him anyways. I'd be surprised if Blood cracks 44% of the vote on election day. Nebraska's a red state, and I want to get more polling that actually shows her within a few points for me to move it down to likely are. It's not like Pete Ricketts, the incumbent Republican, is particularly unpopular either. So I think Nebraska, stay far. Again, don't get clickbaited here. Now, the final race is South Dakota, and South Dakota was really tight in 2018. It only went to Kristi Noem by about 11,000 votes over Democrat Billy Sutton. And as you can see right here, Billy Sutton did really well. He won a lot of counties that were overwhelmingly for Trump in 2020. If you take a look at 2020 South Dakota, Trump won statewide by over 26 points. Sutton only lost by 3.5. So he was a big overperformer, but here's the thing. I don't think it's going to be that close again. The only argument for it actually being close is that Kristi Noem is fairly unpopular, which, yeah, she's not, very popular in South Dakota. That is true. And, in this one poll we have from South Dakota State University, Noem's only up by 4, and she's not even at, 45, she's barely 45% of the vote. And yes, you can make that argument. You can say, look, this race is going to be close because Kristi Noem's unpopular, and because if you take a look at the polls, this nonpartisan poll has it within 4%. Now, I don't really buy into that. Kristi Noem is not a particularly popular governor, but she's not unpopular enough for Trump voters to vote against her. And like the reason it was so close in 2018 was because A, she was not an incumbent. B, Billy Sutton ran as a pro-gun Democrat, so he was a very unique breed of Democrat who had specific appeal to South Dakotans who are Republican. And third, most importantly, 2018 was again a D+9 federal year. This year is going to be, like I've said, neutral, maybe R+1, something in that range. So if we assume a neutral year, that automatically swings 9% to the right. So that would be what, a 12.5-point victory for Kristi Noem there. Add in the fact that she's now an incumbent. Incumbencies tend, in governor races tend to be worth 2 to 5 points. So let's just say it's on the low end. Let's say 3 points. That's a 15.5 margin of victory. And Jamie Smith, the Democrat here, is a solid candidate. I think he's a good recruit, but he's not at the level of Billy Sutton. And I think throw that in, you get an 18, 19-point Kristi Noem victory. And I think that's where I'm at right now. Again, local races are not necessarily always correlated to national partisanship, but it is important to throw that in at least to some degree. And so, polarization, incumbency, the fact that Jamie Smith isn't necessarily as, I don't want to disrespect Jamie Smith. I think he's a really good recruit for Democrats, but he is not Billy Sutton. And if Billy Sutton couldn't get it done in 2018 in a blue wave year against a non-incumbent Republican governor who was, arguably more unpopular back then than she is now, don't see how he gets it done this time. Don't see how this state flips blue. So South Dakota, again, do not buy into the hype. It might be closer than 15% at best for Democrats, but I still don't see any chance for it to flip. I would be shocked if any of these states, like excluding Kansas, are within single digits. So if you want margin predictions for this, South Dakota, I think Noem wins by like 17 or 18. Nebraska, I think, votes for Carol Blood, or for Jim Pillen by about 15. Kansas, I think Laura Kelly loses to Derek Schmidt by about 4.5. Oklahoma, I think, goes to Kevin Stitt by about 20 points. So Great Plains, I think, are going to go red this year. There's been a lot of talk about a blue sweep. Democrats holding on to Kansas, flipping Oklahoma, Nebraska, and South Dakota just because of the polls. I don't buy it. I think it's going to be the opposite. I think it's going to be a red sweep in the Great Plains. So thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I'm going to see you all in the next video. Bye, guys.